Welcome back to Bite Size Bible. In our last session, I returned us to the question that we've been pondering as we've looked at the end times, which is balancing Jesus telling us to be ready because the end could come at any time, with Jesus talking to us about signs that needed to happen first. And when we look at that, we can start to see that it seems to be that there are a number of things that do need to happen before Jesus returns. Today I want to step back onto my rice paper road. That road where it feels like a slightest slip and I could create a big tear. And I want to very tentatively step into the arena of looking at an area of controversy. I do this carefully. My observations are that the subject that we're going to look at today is an area where many Christians feel so passionately about. And I will hear Christians who will be very quick to condemn other Christians and tell people that they're heretical if they don't believe their interpretation of some of the end times thinking. And I've seen people talk about Christians, not being blessed unless they agree with this particular or people's particular interpretations on the subject we're going to look at today. And that subject is this: where does Israel and the people of Israel, the nation of Israel, the people of God, fit with our understanding of the end times? This is an area where there's many different views. But I want us to consider one or two aspects of this as we ask ourselves this question about God's purposes and plans through the end times. What do I mean by this? Well, the question of Israel is something that causes an awful lot of debate between believers. And when we look at what the Bible has to say about the people of Israel, there are different ways to look at it. Is what we're reading in some of the end times talking about the physical geography of Israel, or is it talking about the people of Israel? But also, how do we understand where the church fits with this, and where does the church fit into the understanding of some of this end times? To help us to sort of unpack some of this and to think about it, I want to explain a few background pieces of information. We've already looked at Daniel 9:24, where Daniel was prophesying about 70 sets of 7. And in that passage, God specifically says to Daniel that these 70 sets of 7 relate to your people and the holy city, your city. In other words, what Daniel is seeing, this prophecy about the end time, God is saying this relates to Israel and Jerusalem. And that creates an awful lot of questions for us about how does all this work. Because 69 of these sets of 7 we've already seen have been fulfilled. And then we've had this stopwatch that's been stopped at the point where Jesus died, and the temple was then destroyed in AD 70 by the Romans. At that point, Israel's broken up. But in Ezekiel 20, verse 34, God's prophesied about bringing back the nation of Israel. And this begins to create a whole load of questions for us about God's purposes and plans. If we look at that passage from Ezekiel that I just referred to, we read God say through the prophet Ezekiel, "I will bring you from the nations and gather you from the countries where you have been scattered, with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm." There's a prophecy there that God says he will bring back the nation of Israel. And until 1948, there wasn't a nation of Israel. When Israel then returned in 1948, and in 1967 we see Israel then returning to Jerusalem, we start to see some of these prophecies being fulfilled as people are being gathered back again. And we've already talked about the idea that this stopwatch begins to click. Humanly speaking, there's an awful lot of logic that what we read in the end times is going to be focused on Israel. As Christians, as believers, we share a common history with the Jews. that recognises that our history and our understanding of God is that he has revealed himself through the Jewish nation to the world. So in the beginning, God was focused on Israel. Jesus came as a Jew into Israel and died in Israel. He returned, and his disciples and his focus and his ministry prior to his death and his resurrection appearances were in Israel. He ascended to heaven, and we're told he'll come back in the way it's gone. It seems perfectly logical to me that given that the whole of the underlying story of Christianity is rooted around the nation of Israel, that the end times would be as well. But there's much more to it than that. And let's begin to unpack and ask some of the questions about that. In Daniel chapter 9 and 2 Thessalonians 2, when Paul's writing, we see reference to the temple being desecrated. And in Revelation chapter 11 and the first 2 verses, we see an instruction for the temple to be measured and to look at the size of it. In Amos 9 verse 11, we see another prophecy where Amos is prophesying about the restoration of the temple. And in Isaiah chapter 2, we see that he also prophesies that in the last days the temple will be established again. Clearly there is a focus that the end times are going to be around the temple. And when we read through Revelation and we see the focus and the attack on the temple, we find ourselves with the question that there does seem to be this focus on Jerusalem. But although Israel's come back, and they're back in Jerusalem, and some of these prophecies are being fulfilled, it's like the stopwatch is there and someone's got their finger on the stopwatch, ready to push the clock going again at a certain point where we hit the tribulation with 7 years. If we think that some of this seems a bit sort of crazy, the end time focus on Jerusalem is actually focused, when we think about the temple, on one of the areas of the most contested real estate in the world. Where you see the temple and the Dome of the Rock, you see the opposition and the focus that there is on that area. We look at something like Revelation and say, how could it happen? But in 2018, the rabbis from the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, it's reported that they petitioned the mayoral candidates for Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. When we begin to look at end times, we begin to see that there is this question of God's focus on Israel, on Jerusalem, on the temple. And so where does the church fit into that picture?